The European Union's energy strategy has been under scrutiny since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, with critics accusing the EU of prioritizing energy security over human rights by cozying up to Azerbaijan. The bloc has been desperate to reduce its reliance on Russian natural gas, which once powered a significant chunk of European homes and industries. After Moscow's aggression, the EU scrambled to find alternative suppliers, and Azerbaijan, with its modest but strategic gas reserves, emerged as a key partner. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called Azerbaijan a reliable partner in 2022, signing deals to ramp up gas imports through the Southern Gas Corridor pipeline. But this pivot has sparked controversy, with many arguing that the EU is turning a blind eye to Azerbaijan's authoritarian regime and human rights abuses just to keep the lights on. This video dives into the accusations, exploring why Europe's relationship with Azerbaijan is so contentious and what it means for the future. Let's start with the gas. Azerbaijan supplies about 4.3% of the EU's natural gas, a small but growing share, with countries like Bulgaria relying on it for up to 40% of their imports, and Italy and Greece around 15%. The Southern Gas Corridor, a pipeline stretching from the Caspian Sea to Europe, has been a cornerstone of this partnership, with plans to double exports to 20 billion cubic meters by 2027. The EU sees this as a critical step to diversify away from Russia, which still supplies gas through routes like the Turk Stream pipeline despite sanctions. But here's the catch. Some critics, including activists on platforms like X, claim Azerbaijan might be laundering Russian gas, rebranding it as Azare to skirt sanctions. A 2022 report by academic Gubati Badulu alleged that Azerbaijan was importing Russian gas to meet its domestic needs, freeing up its own reserves for export to Europe. If true, this undermines the EU's entire diversification strategy, making its moral posturing look hypocritical. Now, let's talk about Azerbaijan's leader, President Ilham Aliyev, who has been in power since 2003 and won a fifth term in an election critics say was rigged. Under his rule, Azerbaijan has cracked down hard on dissent. Since the EU deepened ties, Aliyev's government has arrested at least 21 journalists, shut down the Baku offices of the UN, BBC and International Red Cross, and forced the Armenian population out of the region in 2023, an action many call ethnic cleansing. Aliyev justifies this by claiming he's protecting Azerbaijan from external influences, but human rights groups say it's a blatant power grab. The European Parliament pushed for sanctions on Baku last year, citing these abuses, but EU Foreign Policy Chief Chia, during a 2024 visit to Baku, focused on great potential for ties rather than criticism. This silence has fueled accusations that the EU is prioritizing gas over principles. Why is the EU so hesitant to push back? It's not just about gas volumes, it's about geopolitics. Azerbaijan has positioned itself as an anti-Russia player in the Caucasus, a region Moscow has long dominated. Aliyev has supported Ukraine's territorial integrity, supplied humanitarian aid, and even seen tensions with Russia spike after a 2024 plane crash, likely caused by a Russian missile, killed 38 others. For the EU, Azerbaijan's defiance of Moscow is a strategic win, especially as Russia's influence wanes. But this comes at a cost. Former Latvian diplomat Eldar Mammadov told the BBC that the EU's focused on countering Russia has made Azerbaijan's repression a non-issue in Brussels. The EU insists it raises human rights concerns privately, but public silence suggests energy security trumps values. There's another layer here. Azerbaijan's role at COP29, hosted in Baku in 2024, raised eyebrows. Aliyev used the global stage to call out Western hypocrisy, pointing out that Europe begged for his gas while criticizing his environmental record. Meanwhile, France's climate envoy boycotted the summit after Aliyev accused Paris of suppressing protests in its territories. This spat highlights the broader tension. The EU needs Azerbaijan's gas, but its reliance gives Aliyev leverage to deflect criticism. Some argue this dynamic empowers authoritarian regimes, as the EU's moral compromises signal that energy deals can buy silence. Others, though, see it as realpolitik. Europe can't freeze or go dark, and Azerbaijan, unlike Russia, doesn't wield nuclear threats. The counterargument is that the EU has little choice. Cutting Russian gas was urgent, and alternatives like U.S. liquefied natural gas are pricier and logistically complex. Azerbaijan's pipeline is already built, and its gas is cheaper. Plus, the EU argues it's engaging Azerbaijan on human rights. Behind closed doors, a spokesperson told the BBC that the bloc has called for the release of arbitrarily detained journalists and activists. But critics like those on Reddit /r point out the inconsistency. How can the EU champion a rules-based order while ignoring Aliyev's crackdowns? They argue the EU's selective outrage loud against Russia, quiet on Azerbaijan damages its credibility. What about the Russian gas laundering claims? The evidence is murky. Azerbaijan's deal to import Russian gas in 2022 raised suspicions, especially since Gazprom, Russia's state-owned energy giant, has stakes in Azeri gas fields, but Azerbaijan's energy ministry denies rebranding Russian gas, and experts note that its domestic production, while limited, can still meet export commitments. The Southern Gas Corridor's capacity is maxed out, though, so doubling exports by 2027 might require Turkmenistan's gas or other sources, which could complicate things further. If Azerbaijan is indeed funneling Russian gas, it has a clever workaround that exposes the EU's weak spot. Its desperate need for energy makes it vulnerable to manipulation. So, what's the bigger picture? The EU's Azerbaijan gamble shows the messy trade-offs of energy politics. On one hand, diversifying from Russia is a security must. On the other, partnering with an authoritarian regime risks undermining the EU's values. The bloc's critics argue it's repeating old mistakes, swapping one problematic supplier for another. Posts on X reflect public frustration, with users like @Natalie63788 calling it hypocrisy on steroids. Yet, defenders say the EU is navigating a brutal reality. Energy shortages could cripple economies, and Azerbaijan's gas, while not perfect, keeps the system running. The question is whether the EU can balance its principles with pragmatism, or if it's just kicking the can down the road. Looking ahead, the EU faces tough choices. It could push harder for renewables to reduce reliance on regimes like Azerbaijan's, but that's a long-term fix. For now, gas is king, and Azerbaijan knows it. Aliyev's leverage will likely grow as Europe leans on its pipelines. Especially if tensions with Russia persist, the EU could try tougher diplomacy, like targeted sanctions, but that risks alienating a key supplier. Meanwhile, the human rights situation in Azerbaijan isn't improving, and the EU's silence might embolden Aliyev further. As one ex-user put it, flirting with Baku has a cost. The challenge for Europe is clear. How do you secure energy without selling your soul? That's the question we'll keep wrestling with as this story unfolds.